A millionaire, isolated on a remote farm, started practicing knife throwing with a horse tied up in the middle of the field. At first, no one cared, until mysterious notes, secret footage, and a shocking revelation that even stunned the police put the entire town on high alert. And the ending? It will leave you speechless. Subscribe now and get ready. Meadowbrook, a sleepy town nestled in the rolling hills of Montana, had always prided itself on its predictable rhythm. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the local diner served the same special every Wednesday, and where gossip was the most valuable currency. For generations, families had built their lives here, content with the simplicity and safety that came with small-town living. That all changed the day Harrison Wells purchased the old Carlton estate on the outskirts of town. At first, the arrival of a wealthy outsider had sparked typical curiosity. Some hoped his presence might breathe new life into Meadowbrook's dwindling economy. Others were naturally suspicious of anyone who could afford to buy 300 acres of prime Montana land without blinking an eye. "I heard he made his fortune in tech," Maggie Jenkins said as she poured coffee for the regulars at the Bluegrass Diner. "Something about developing software for Wall Street types." "Whatever it is, must be nice to have that kind of money," replied Sheriff Tom Landry, who'd grown up watching his father patrol these same streets before him. "As long as he keeps to himself and follows our laws, I don't much care where his dollars come from." For the first 2 months, Wells seemed determined to do just that. The massive iron gates at the entrance to his property remained closed, with only occasional deliveries of construction materials, suggesting any activity beyond. Some townsfolk spotted workers coming and going, but they were all from out of town. Contractors who wouldn't share details about their employer or his projects. It was Ellie Parker, whose modest farm shared a boundary with the eastern edge of the Carlton property, who first noticed something unusual. One evening in early autumn, as she was checking on her horses before sunset, she heard a distinctive sound carrying on the wind. A sharp, metallic whistle, followed by a solid thunk. Again and again, the pattern repeated. The next morning, over fresh biscuits at the diner, Ellie mentioned what she'd heard to her friend Sarah Cooper, the town veterinarian. "It sounded like someone throwing something," Ellie said, lowering her voice. "And I swear I heard a horse too, but it wasn't normal. It sounded scared." Sarah frowned. "Maybe he's just training a skittish horse. New environment can make them nervous." "Maybe," Ellie conceded, but the furrow in her brow remained. A week later, while hiking along the creek that cut through both properties, Ellie's teenage son Tyler made a discovery that turned whispered curiosity into something more concerning. "Mom!" he called, bursting through the back door after his afternoon exploration. "You won't believe what I found." In his hand, he held a throwing knife, its blade wickedly sharp, and its handle inlaid with expensive-looking mother-of-pearl. Engraved. On the blade was a simple insignia, HW. It was stuck in a tree right by the creek. There were others too, all over the place. Ellie took the knife carefully, examining the craftsmanship. "Tyler, you shouldn't have taken this. It's not yours." "But Mom, that's not all," the boy insisted, his eyes wide with excitement and something else concern. "I saw a horse, a beautiful palomino tied up in this clearing. There were targets set up all around it, like wooden bullseyes, and they all had knives in them, like this one." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of her kitchen. "Was the horse okay?" Tyler hesitated. "It looked scared, really scared. It was just standing there, but it was shaking all over." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The image of a frightened horse surrounded by knife targets kept her tossing and turning. By morning, she'd made a decision. After sending Tyler off to school, she drove into town and parked outside the small sheriff's office. Tom Landry looked up from his paperwork as Ellie entered, placing the knife on his desk without preamble. "Found on my property," she said simply. Or rather, Tyler did, near the boundary with the Carlton place. The sheriff picked up the blade, whistling low. "Custom job? Expensive." He turned it over, noting the initials. "You think Wells is throwing these around?" Tyler saw more, and a horse, Tom, tied up, surrounded by targets. Sheriff Landry leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking in protest. "Not illegal to practice knife throwing on your own property, Ellie," with a terrified horse as the centerpiece. Her voice rose slightly. "Come on, Tom. You know, that's not right." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his weathered face. "I'll look into it discreetly, but without cause, I can't just march onto his property demanding answers." Word spread quickly, as it always did in Meadowbrook. By afternoon, half the town had heard some version of Tyler's discovery. By evening, the story had grown to include multiple horses, mysterious late-night gatherings, and even stranger theories. "I drove by last night," Jack Henderson told a rapt audience, "at the local bar. Saw lights out there like you wouldn't believe. And the sounds..." He shook his head, taking a long swig of beer. "Not natural." 3 days later, Sarah Cooper received a call from Harrison Wells himself. "I understand you're the local veterinarian," he said, his voice cultured and smooth over the phone. "I have a horse that needs checking. Nothing serious, just a routine examination." Sarah agreed to drive out the following morning. When she arrived at the imposing gates, they swung open, automatically allowing her to drive up the newly paved road to the main house. The original Carlton farmhouse had been completely renovated, transformed into a sprawling modern mansion that seemed out of place in rural Montana. Wells met her at the door, tall and imposing, with silver-streaked dark hair and the physicality of someone who stayed active despite his wealth. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dr. Cooper, thank you for coming on short notice." He led her to a state-of-the-art stable behind the main house, where a beautiful palomino stood in a spacious stall. Sarah immediately noticed the horse's behavior, ears flattened, muscles tense, eyes wary. "This is Duke," Wells said, gesturing. "I acquired him recently. Been a bit skittish." Sarah approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones to the nervous animal. As she examined him, she noticed thin marks around his flanks. Not wounds exactly, but places where something had grazed the skin, leaving slight abrasions. "Has he been injured?" she asked casually, running her hands along the marks. "Not that I'm aware of," Wells replied, his voice neutral. "As I said, he's skittish, probably hurt himself against the stall." Sarah nodded, continuing her examination. When she moved to Duke's neck and shoulders, she found more concerning signs. Rope burns, subtle but unmistakable to her trained eye. "Mr. Wells," she began carefully, "these marks suggest Duke has been restrained rather tightly, in ways that aren't typical for normal horse handling." Something flickered in Wells's expression. Annoyance? Concern? It passed too quickly to identify. "I have trainers who work with him," he said dismissively. "Perhaps their methods are different from what you're used to in a small town like this." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Sarah finished her examination in uncomfortable silence, providing Wells with basic care instructions and a mild sedative to help with the anxiety. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The horse's fear was too profound, the marks too specific. And there had been something in Wells's manner, a coldness, a calculation, that left her unsettled. That evening, Sarah found herself at Ellie's kitchen table, recounting her visit in hushed tones while Tyler was upstairs doing homework. "I think your son was right," she concluded. "That horse is terrified, and not without reason." Ellie poured them both another cup of tea. "So what do we do?" Sarah stared into her cup, watching the steam rise. "I don't know, but I can't stop thinking about that poor animal." "And I can't," help wondering what as if he has others, and what exactly he's using them for. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of metal cutting through air, followed by the solid thunk of a blade finding its target. The following week brought unusual activity to Meadowbrook. Black SUVs with tinted windows appeared in town. Their occupants, men in expensive suits who spoke little and observed much, stood out like wolves among sheep. They booked rooms at the only motel in town, paid in cash, and asked pointed questions about the Carlton estate and its new owner. They're not saying much, but they're definitely interested in Wells, Maggie reported during the morning rush. At the diner, one of them left his card, some investment firm from New York. Sheriff Landry studied the business card she'd handed him. Blackstone Partners, he read aloud. Wealth management and private investments. Why would investment bankers care about a place like Meadowbrook? Asked Jack Henderson, leaning over from the next booth. Maybe they're looking to invest in the area, suggested Mayor Wilson, always optimistic about potential economic opportunities. God knows we could use it. But Ellie Parker, who had stopped by to pick up breakfast, before heading to the feed store, felt a creeping unease. Or maybe they're here for whatever Wells is planning. The sheriff tucked the card into his pocket. I think it's time I paid our new resident an official welcome visit. When Sheriff Landry arrived at the Carlton estate that afternoon, he was surprised to find the gates open and a flurry of activity in the main yard. Workers were constructing what appeared to be an elaborate arena in the clearing behind the house, wooden stands surrounding a circular space with strange metal fixtures being installed around the perimeter. Harrison Wells emerged from the house as the sheriff parked his cruiser. Today, the wealthy man wore riding boots and carried a leather glove in one hand. "Sheriff," he called, his voice pleasant but his eyes calculating. "To what do I owe this visit? Something amiss in your quiet little town?" Tom Landry removed his hat, a gesture of politeness his father had taught him long ago. "Just a courtesy call, Mr. Wells. Noticed you've had some visitors in town asking about your property. Thought I'd check if everything's all right." Wells gestured toward the construction, just preparing for a private event. Nothing that should concern local law enforcement. "What kind of event?" the sheriff asked, eyeing the arena. "A demonstration of sorts for potential investors." Wells's smile tightened slightly. "I have interests in various entertainment ventures. This is merely a prototype showcase." "Entertainment?" Sheriff Landry echoed, thinking of the knife Tyler had found, the frightened horse Sarah had examined. "Precision sports specifically," Wells elaborated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I find traditional rodeo lacks a certain edge. What I'm developing combines elements of several disciplines, quite revolutionary, actually." Before the sheriff could press further, a loud commotion erupted from the newly constructed stable. A horse's frightened neigh, followed by the sound of something heavy falling. "Excuse me," Wells said tightly. "My trainers sometimes struggle with the more spirited animals." As Wells strode toward the stable, the sheriff took the opportunity to study the arena more closely. The metal fixtures looked like movable targets, designed to rotate or appear suddenly. In the center, a sturdy post with restraints had been installed. A cold feeling settled in Tom Landry's stomach as he pieced together what he was seeing. This wasn't just a practice area, it was a performance space designed for an audience to watch. What exactly? He was about to head toward the stable when Wells returned, his expression controlled, but tension visible in his shoulders. "Everything all right?" the sheriff asked. "Perfectly fine, just a minor training issue." Wells gestured toward the driveway. "If that's all, Sheriff, I have quite a lot to prepare before my guests arrive this weekend." Tom Landry nodded slowly, settling his hat back on his head. "Of course, just doing my duty checking in on new residents, especially those bringing business associates to our town." As he drove away, the sheriff couldn't shake the image of that arena or the sounds of the distressed horse. Whatever Wells was planning, it didn't sit right with him. But suspicion wasn't grounds for investigation, and wealthy men like Harrison, Wells had ways of making problems disappear, legal or otherwise. Back in town, Sarah Cooper was facing a dilemma of her own. She'd received an unexpected delivery at her veterinary clinic, a package of medications ordered by Harrison Wells to be held for his private animal handler to collect. The order included powerful sedatives, muscle relaxants, and stimulants, in quantities that seemed excessive for normal veterinary use. "Is there a problem with the order?" asked the delivery driver, noticing her hesitation. Sarah quickly signed for the package. "No, everything's fine. I'll make sure Mr. Wells gets these." But after the driver left, she stared at the box with growing concern. As the town's only veterinarian, she had ethical obligations, not just to animal owners but to the animals themselves. These medications in these combinations suggested something troubling. She picked up her phone and called Ellie. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. "And Sheriff Landry too. There's something happening at the Wells place, and I think it's worse than we thought." That evening, a small group gathered at Ellie's farmhouse. Sarah, Sheriff Landry, Ellie, and unexpectedly, Jason Miller, the town's high school history teacher who had once worked as a journalist before settling in Meadowbrook. "I've been doing some digging," Jason said, spreading printouts across Ellie's kitchen table. "Harrison Wells isn't just wealthy, he's notorious in certain circles, made his first fortune in tech, then diversified into private entertainment ventures for the ultra-rich." "What kind of entertainment?" Ellie asked, pouring coffee for everyone. Jason hesitated. "The kind that doesn't ask too many questions about regulations or ethics. Underground fighting circuits, extreme hunting experiences, high-stakes gambling on unusual competitions." "How is this legal?" Sarah asked, horrified. "It exists in gray areas," Jason explained. "Private clubs, invitation-only events held in places with flexible oversight, usually overseas or on private properties in remote locations." Sheriff Landry rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Like a recently purchased estate in the middle of nowhere, Montana." "Exactly," Jason confirmed. "And look at this." He pointed to a blurry photograph taken at what appeared to be an exclusive party. In the background, barely visible, was a setup similar to what the sheriff had described, seeing at Wells's property, an arena-like space with targets and a central post. "What exactly happens in these events?" Ellie asked, her voice tight with apprehension. Jason shook his head. "Details are sketchy. Participants sign NDAs. But from what I've gathered, Wells has pioneered a form of entertainment he calls precision extremes. And it involves demonstrations of accuracy with various weapons. Apparently knife throwing is his specialty, combined with living elements to increase the stakes." "Living elements," Sarah repeated flatly. "You mean animals?" "Or people," Jason said quietly. "Willing participants paid very well to stay still, while experts throw knives around them. But the horse Tyler saw, the one I examined, it wasn't willing," Sarah interjected. "It was terrified." Sheriff Landry leaned forward. "So you think Wells is using horses as, what, props in some kind of dangerous knife-throwing exhibition?" "I think it's more than that," Jason replied, his expression grim. "From what I've heard, Wells's events are all about escalation, increasing risk, pushing boundaries. The audiences who attend these things, billionaires, celebrities hiding behind aliases, people who've become numb to conventional thrills, they pay enormous sums to see something shocking." A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as they absorbed this information. "Those men in town," Ellie finally said, "they're not investors in the traditional sense. They're clients," Jason confirmed, "coming to see a private demonstration before a larger event, I'd guess." Sheriff Landry stood up, pacing the small kitchen. This puts me in a difficult position. Without evidence of actual animal mistreatment or illegal activity, I have no grounds to intervene. What about those medications? Sarah asked. The combinations he ordered, they could immobilize a horse while keeping it conscious. That's not standard practice for any legitimate horse training. Suspicious, yes. Illegal, not necessarily, the sheriff replied. He could claim it's for medical treatment. So we just wait until he does something we can prove is wrong? Ellie demanded, frustration evident in her voice. By then it could be too late for that horse, or for others. Tyler appeared in the doorway, having obviously been listening from the hallway. What if we got proof? He suggested. What if we could see what's really happening there? Absolutely not, Ellie said firmly. I don't want you anywhere near that property, Tyler. But the teenager's suggestion had planted a seed. Jason looked thoughtful. The kid has a point. We need evidence, and I might have a way to get it. Later that night, after the others had gone and Tyler was asleep, Ellie stood on her back porch, looking out toward the lights of the Wells property visible in the distance. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and earth, familiar and comforting, against the unsettling thoughts swirling in her mind. Her attention was caught by movement at the edge of her property. A large figure emerged from the tree line, a horse moving erratically, as if disoriented. Even in the dim moonlight, she could see it was the Palomino Duke. Ellie quickly grabbed a halter from the hook by the door and approached slowly, speaking in soothing tones. The horse was sweating profusely despite the cool night, its eyes wild with fear and its movements uncoordinated. As she drew closer, she could see fresh marks on its flanks, not cuts exactly, but long, thin abrasions, as if something sharp had repeatedly grazed its skin with precision. Something glinted in the moonlight. A small electronic device attached to the horse's bridle. A tracking tag, she realized, which meant Wells would soon be looking for his escaped animal. Ellie made a split-second decision. She removed the tracking device, then led the trembling horse to her smallest outbuilding, a tool she'd rarely used this time of year. After securing him inside with water and some hay, she hurried back to the house and called Sarah. "This is insane, Ellie," Sarah whispered as she examined Duke in the dim light of the tool shed. It was just past midnight, and both women kept glancing nervously toward the road, expecting Harrison Wells or his people to appear at any moment. "These marks are fresh, and look at his eyes. He's been drugged." The Palomino stood unsteadily, his magnificent coat dulled with sweat and his eyes unfocused. Sarah drew a small vial of blood, planning to test it later at her clinic. She also took photographs of the abrasions on the horse's flanks and the rope burns around his neck. "What do we do now?" Ellie asked, stroking Duke's nose gently. "Wells will be looking for him." Sarah finished her examination and straightened up. "We called Tom. This is evidence of animal mistreatment, clear and documented." "And then what?" "We give the horse back to Wells." Ellie's voice hardened. "So he can continue whatever sick game he's playing." Sarah had no answer. Both women knew the legal realities. Duke was property, and Harrison Wells had resources they couldn't hope to match in a legal battle. They were still debating their options when headlights swept across the driveway. Both women tensed, but it was Sheriff Landry's cruiser that pulled up, followed by Jason's battered pickup truck. "Got your message," Tom said as he entered the shed, then stopped short at the sight of Duke. "Well, I'll be damned." Jason was already taking photos with a professional camera. "This changes everything," he said. "We have physical evidence now." "Evidence of what exactly?" The sheriff ran a hand along Duke's flank, examining the marks. "Mistreatment, yes, but not necessarily anything criminal." "It's enough to get a warrant," Sarah insisted, "to check his property, see what's really happening there." Sheriff Landry looked skeptical. "Maybe, but Wells has connections. One phone call to the right judge or politician could shut down any investigation before it starts." "Then we need more than just the horse," Jason said, lowering his camera. We need to document what's happening inside that property." The group fell silent, considering the implications. Breaking into Wells's estate would be illegal and potentially dangerous. "There might be another way," Sarah said slowly. "Wells doesn't know me well. I could offer my services for the event. Say I heard he might need a veterinarian on standby." "Absolutely not," the sheriff said firmly. "It's too risky." "I agree," Ellie added. "Besides, he'd be suspicious." "Why would you suddenly volunteer?" Jason had been quietly examining the tracking device Ellie had removed from Duke's bridle. "Maybe we don't need to go inside at all," he mused. "This is a sophisticated piece of equipment. GPS tracking, probably remote monitoring capabilities. I bet Wells has similar devices on all his animals." "So?" Tom asked. "So these things work both ways," Jason explained. "If I can hack into this, we might be able to access Wells's tracking system, see where his animals are, maybe even get data on their condition." "You can do that?" Ellie asked, surprised. Jason smiled slightly. "Before I was a history teacher in a small town, I spent 5 years as an investigative tech journalist. I've picked up a few skills." While they talked, Duke had begun to calm down, the wild look in his eyes gradually fading as the drugs worked their way out of his system. He leaned his head against Ellie, seeking comfort. "We still have to decide what to do with him," Sarah reminded them, nodding toward the horse. "Wells will report him missing by morning." Sheriff Landry considered for a moment. "Let me handle that. I'll tell Wells that Duke was found wandering on the main road. Say he's being kept at the county animal facility until he can be properly examined. Standard procedure when valuable animals are found in distress." "He won't like that," Sarah warned. "No, he won't," the sheriff agreed. "But it'll buy us a day or two, maybe long enough for Jason to work his magic on that tracker." As dawn approached, they finalized their plan. Duke would be transported to the county facility where he'd be protected by official custody. Jason would work on hacking the tracking device. Sarah would analyze the blood samples for evidence of unauthorized drugs. And Sheriff Landry would prepare the paperwork for a potential investigation, ready to move the moment they had sufficient evidence. Before they parted, Ellie asked the question they'd all been avoiding. What if Wells decides to cut his losses? What if he just leaves town and takes his sick entertainment elsewhere? "Then at least we've saved Duke," Sarah said softly, "and maybe disrupted whatever he was planning here." "It won't end with him leaving," Jason said, his expression serious. "Men like Wells don't walk away from investments this size. Whatever he's planning, it's too important to him, too valuable." The sheriff nodded in agreement. "We'd better be ready, because if we push him into a corner, there's no telling how he'll react." Harrison Wells's reaction came sooner and more forcefully than any of them anticipated. By mid-morning, 2 black SUVs were parked outside the sheriff's office, and Wells himself was demanding the immediate return of his stolen property. "This is outrageous," he fumed, pacing the small office while his lawyer, a stone-faced woman in an immaculate suit, sat calmly reviewing documents. "That horse is worth more than your annual budget, Sheriff. I want it returned immediately." "Sheriff." Landry maintained his composure. "As I explained, Mr. Wells, we're following standard procedure. When valuable animals are found in distress on public roads, we're required to ensure they're fit before releasing them." "My horse wasn't found," Wells retorted. "It was taken from my property." "Do you have evidence of that?" the sheriff asked mildly. "Because I have a report from a motorist who nearly hit a palomino wandering on Route 16 at approximately 11:30 last night." Wells's eyes narrowed. "We both know that's not what happened. Someone in this backward little town has decided to interfere in my business." "And what business would that be exactly?" Sheriff Landry leaned forward slightly. "I'm still not clear on what you're developing out at the Carlton place." The wealthy man's face hardened. My attorney will handle this from here. I expect my property returned by end of day, or you'll be facing legal action that will make your head spin." After Wells stormed out, his lawyer remained behind, her expression neutral as she presented the sheriff with a stack of documents. "These are ownership papers for the animal in question, medical records, and a formal request for immediate release," she said coolly. "Additionally, here's a cease and desist order regarding any further interference with Mr. Wells's property or business activities." Sheriff Landry accepted the papers without comment. Once alone, he immediately called Jason. "Wells is pushing back hard," he reported. "We need to move fast. How's it coming with that tracker?" "Making progress," Jason replied. "These aren't off-the-shelf components. Custom-built, military-grade stuff. But I've isolated the transmission frequency. With a bit more time, I should be able to access his monitoring system." "Time is one thing we don't have much of," the sheriff warned. "His lawyer's breathing down my neck, and I can only stall on releasing Duke for another day, max." Meanwhile, at her clinic, Sarah was studying the results of Duke's blood tests with growing alarm. The horse had been given a complex cocktail of drugs, a mild sedative to keep him manageable, combined with a stimulant to keep him alert and responsive to fear. It was a deliberately calibrated mixture designed to maintain a state of controlled terror. "This is unconscionable," she murmured to herself, documenting her findings. No legitimate horse training would ever use such methods. The only purpose could be to enhance the animal's fear response for entertainment. She was preparing her report when the clinic door chimed. Looking up, she was startled to see one of Wells's associates, a tall, muscular man she recognized from his previous visit to collect medications. "Dr. Cooper," he said with a thin smile. "Mr. Wells sent me to collect a special order." Sarah kept her expression professional. "I don't have any pending orders for Mr. Wells." The man's smile didn't waver. "There must be some mistake. He specifically mentioned you were holding something for him." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized the man was staring at her computer, where Duke's test results were still displayed on the screen. She casually moved to stand in front of the monitor. "I'm afraid I can't help you. Perhaps Mr. Wells confused me with another veterinarian." The man's eyes hardened. "That seems unlikely. Mr. Wells is very precise." He glanced around the clinic. "Small practice you have here. Must be difficult maintaining a business in a town this size." The threat was barely veiled. Sarah stood her ground. "If Mr. Wells needs anything, he's welcome to call me directly." After an uncomfortable pause, the man nodded and turned to leave. But at the door, he paused. "One more thing, Dr. Cooper. Mr. Wells is very fond of that Palomino. He'd be extremely disappointed if anything happened to it." After he left, Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial Ellie's number. "They know," she said when her friend answered. "Wells knows we're involved." Back at her farm, Ellie ended the call with Sarah and immediately checked on Tyler, who was supposed to be working on his distance learning assignments in the living room. But the room was empty, his laptop open but idle on the coffee table. "Tyler!" she called, a note of panic creeping into her voice. She rushed through the house, checking each room, then ran outside to scan the property. Her son was nowhere to be found. With growing dread, she called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She was about to call the sheriff when her own phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your son is safe, for now. Stop interfering in matters that don't concern you, or that will change. Duke must be returned by sunset. No authorities." Attached was a photo of Tyler sitting in what appeared to be an elegant study, looking frightened but unharmed. Ellie's world tilted as terror and rage flooded through her. She'd been prepared for Wells to fight back legally, perhaps even to threaten their livelihoods. But this, targeting her child, was beyond anything she'd imagined. With shaking hands, she forwarded the message to Sheriff Landry, then grabbed her truck keys. She didn't have a plan, only the raw, primal instinct to protect her son. As she backed out of her driveway, she noticed a piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper, a note in Tyler's handwriting. Mom, went to take photos of Wells's arena. Jason showed me how to use his good camera. Back by lunch. Don't worry. Ellie's heart sank. Her impulsive, brave, foolish son had tried to help in the most dangerous way possible, and now he was paying the price for all of their meddling. Sheriff Tom Landry had faced many challenges during his 15 years in law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of Ellie Parker bursting into his office, wild-eyed, and clutching her phone with the threatening message displayed. "He has my son," she choked out, her voice raw with fear. "Wells has Tyler." The sheriff was on his feet instantly. "Are you certain it's Wells?" "Who else would it be?" Ellie thrust the phone at him. "Read it. They want Duke back by sunset. No authorities involved. It has to be him." Tom studied the message, his law enforcement training kicking in despite the personal connection he felt to the Parker family. This doesn't mention Wells specifically. And why would a man of his resources risk kidnapping charges? It doesn't make sense. "I don't care if it makes sense," Ellie snapped. "My son is being held somewhere and we need to get him back." The sheriff placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "And we will. But rushing in blindly could make things worse." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down. Tell me exactly what happened." As Ellie explained about Tyler's note and subsequent disappearance, Tom's deputy, Mark Reynolds, entered with a troubled expression. "Boss, we've got a situation. Just got a call from Harrison Wells. Says someone trespassed on his property this morning. Security cameras caught a teenager snooping around. Says his security personnel are holding the kid until we get there." Ellie's head snapped up. "He admitted it just like that?" Tom's expression darkened. "So he's playing it as a legitimate security response, claiming his men caught a trespasser?" "That's what he says," the deputy confirmed. "Wants us to come out and handle it officially." The sheriff turned back to Ellie. "This changes things. If Wells is acknowledging he has Tyler and is asking for police involvement, he's creating a legal paper trail. Is that good or bad?" Ellie asked, confused by the sudden shift. "Both," Tom replied grimly. "It means he's confident enough in his position to operate in the open, but it also means he probably isn't planning to harm Tyler. He's just using this situation to his advantage." The unspoken fear lingered in the air between them. "I'm going with you," Ellie insisted, already heading for the door. "That might not be wise," the sheriff cautioned. "Wells is manipulating this situation. If you show up emotional..." "He has my son," Ellie cut him off, her voice steady now, determination replacing panic. "I'm coming." Tom knew better than to argue further. "Fine, but let me do the talking." On the drive to the Wells estate, the sheriff outlined his strategy. "We treat this exactly as Wells is presenting it, a trespassing incident involving a minor. We make no mention of Duke, the tracking device, or any suspicions about his activities." "But what about Tyler? What if Wells won't let him go?" "He will," Tom assured her. "Wells is many things, but he's not stupid. Holding a minor against his will with law enforcement present would cross a line even his money couldn't erase." As they pulled up to the imposing gates of the Carlton estate, Ellie was struck by how much the property had transformed in such a short time. The once neglected farmhouse was now an architectural showcase, and the grounds had been meticulously landscaped. Money, it seemed, could change anything, almost anything. Harrison Wells greeted them at the entrance to the main house, every inch the concerned citizen. "Sheriff, thank you for coming promptly. Mrs. Parker, I wasn't expecting you, but I suppose it makes sense, given the circumstances." "Where's my son?" Ellie demanded. ignoring the sheriff's warning glance. Wells gestured toward the house. Inside, unharmed, I assure you, my security team found him taking photographs of my private training facilities. Given recent incidents involving my property, they were understandably concerned. Sheriff Landry maintained a professional demeanor. We'd like to see the boy, Mr. Wells. Of course, follow me. They were led through the expansive main house, a study in tasteful luxury that somehow still felt cold and impersonal. In a wood-paneled study, Tyler sat in a leather armchair, looking both defiant and frightened. A man in a black suit stood nearby, his posture suggesting he was security rather than household staff. "Tyler!" Ellie rushed to her son, checking him for injuries. "I'm fine, Mom," the teenager muttered, embarrassed but clearly relieved. "They just made me wait here." Sheriff Landry addressed Wells directly. "Mind if I ask your security man to step outside while we discuss this matter?" Wells nodded, and the guard left silently. Once the door closed, the pleasant mask Wells had been wearing slipped slightly. "Let's cut to the chase," he said, his voice harder now. "Your son was caught trespassing on private property with surveillance equipment. I could press charges, but I'm willing to overlook this teenage indiscretion, provided we can resolve another matter." "Duke," Ellie said flatly. Wells raised an eyebrow. "So you are involved. I suspected as much when my horse mysteriously escaped and ended up in county custody." He turned to the sheriff. "I want my property returned, Sheriff. Today. No more bureaucratic delays, no more spurious concerns about the animal's welfare." Tom Landry's expression remained neutral. "The county veterinarian has protocols to follow, Mr. Wells. I can't override those. Can't or won't." Wells' smile was cold. "Let me be perfectly clear. Your little town has been poking into my business since I arrived. It stops now. I have investments at stake, important people arriving tomorrow, and I won't let small-town vigilantism interfere." "Are these important people coming to watch you throw knives around a terrified horse?" Ellie couldn't help asking. Wells's eyes narrowed. "My entertainment concepts are none of your concern, Mrs. Parker, but since you seem so interested, what I do is art, precision performance that pushes boundaries. The animals are props, nothing more. Props that are drugged and traumatized," Ellie shot back. The sheriff placed a restraining hand on Ellie's arm. "Mr. Wells, regardless of our personal feelings, the law is clear. If an animal is found in distress, proper protocols must be followed before it can be released." Wells studied the sheriff for a moment, then changed tactics. "Perhaps we can reach a compromise. Dr. Cooper, your local veterinarian, who I believe is a friend of Mrs. Parker, can examine Duke at the county facility. If she clears him, he's returned to me immediately. In exchange, I'll forget this unfortunate trespassing incident." The sheriff glanced at Ellie, who gave a slight nod. It wasn't ideal, but it would get Tyler home safely. "Agreed," Tom said. "I'll have Dr. Cooper meet us at the facility this afternoon." "Excellent." Wells's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations to complete for tomorrow's demonstration. Tyler, I trust we won't see you on my property again without an invitation." The teenager mumbled an apology, unable to meet the man's gaze. As they left the estate, Ellie couldn't shake the chill that had settled over her. Wells had won this round, manipulating them all with casual ease. In the car, Tyler sat slumped. In the back seat, embarrassment and anger warring on his young face. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally said. "I just wanted to help, to get evidence." Ellie reached back to squeeze his hand. "I know, honey, but it was dangerous." "Did you get any photos before they caught you?" Sheriff Landry asked, eyes still on the road. Tyler straightened up slightly. "Yeah, actually. I hid the memory card in my shoe when I saw them coming." He reached down and retrieved a tiny SD card from inside his sneaker. "I got pictures of the arena and some other stuff. There's more than one horse there, Mom. At least 3 that I saw." The sheriff's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We'll need to see those photos as soon as possible." Back in town, they reconvened at Sarah's veterinary clinic. While Tyler downloaded his photos onto Sarah's computer, the adults discussed their next move. "Wells is expecting Duke to be released today," Tom reminded them. "If Sarah examines him and declares him fit, we have no legal grounds to keep holding him." "But he's not fit," Sarah insisted. "The blood tests show a cocktail of drugs still in his system, and the psychological trauma is evident in his behavior." "Can you document all of that? Make it official?" Jason asked. Sarah nodded. "I can, but it won't matter in the long run. At best, it buys us a few more days of protective custody. Eventually, Wells will get his lawyers to force the issue." "A few days might be enough," Jason said, turning the laptop to show them what Tyler had captured. "These photos are damning. Look at this setup." The images showed the arena from different angles. The central post where animals could be tethered, the mechanical targets that could be activated remotely, and most disturbing, a collection of throwing implements displayed on a wall, knives, axes, even what appeared to be modified throwing stars. "It's like some twisted circus act," Sarah whispered. "And this," Jason continued, scrolling to another image, "this is what Wells has been preparing for." The photo showed a whiteboard in what appeared to be a planning room. On it was a detailed schedule for the exhibition, with a list of attendees' initials and astronomical dollar figures next to each name. "These aren't just wealthy friends coming for a show," Jason explained. "This is an auction. Wells is selling something." "His entertainment concept," Ellie realized. "He's demonstrating his sick show for potential investors." Sheriff Landry studied the images carefully. "This is disturbing, but still not clearly illegal. Cruel, yes. Unethical, absolutely. But animal welfare laws have loopholes big enough to drive a truck through, especially for entertainment purposes." "So we're back to square one," Ellie said bitterly. "We can document the abuse, but we can't stop it." "Maybe we can," Jason said slowly. "Not through legal channels, but through something Wells cares about more, his reputation and his business interests." "What are you suggesting?" Tom asked warily. Jason's expression was grim but determined. Wells's whole business model depends on exclusivity and secrecy. His ultra-wealthy clients don't want their names associated with this kind of entertainment. What if we threaten to expose everything? Blackmail? The sheriff's voice was sharp. "That's a line I won't cross, Jason. Not blackmail," Jason clarified. "Journalism. I still have contacts in the media. One phone call, and this story could be in front of millions of people by tomorrow morning. Wells's wealthy clients would scatter like cockroaches under a spotlight." "He'd retaliate," Sarah warned. "He's already shown he's willing to target Tyler." "Not if we time it right," Jason insisted. "We release the story just as his guests are arriving. By the time Wells realizes what's happening, the damage will be done. His investors will pull out rather than risk being associated with animal cruelty." The group fell silent, weighing the risks. "It's worth a try," Ellie finally said. "We can't just stand by and do nothing." Tom Landry looked troubled. "I can't officially endorse this plan, but Dre," he hesitated, then continued, "as a private citizen, I believe sometimes justice requires creativity when the law falls short." By late afternoon, their plan was set in motion. Sarah would examine Duke at the county facility, documenting his condition, but ultimately clearing him for release, with specific conditions and a follow-up visit scheduled. This would satisfy Wells's immediate demand while maintaining official oversight. Meanwhile, Jason would prepare the story, complete with Tyler's photographs and Sarah's medical reports. He would send it to his media contacts with instructions to publish at precisely 10 a.m. the next day, just as Wells's guests would be arriving for the demonstration. As they finalized the details, Sarah's phone rang. She answered, her expression changing from confusion to alarm as she listened. "That was my assistant," she said after hanging up. 2 more horses were just delivered to Wells's property. Thoroughbreds, and she overheard the transporters saying something about a finale tomorrow that would raise the stakes beyond anything seen before. The implication hung heavy in the room. Whatever Wells had planned for his demonstration, it was escalating beyond what they had initially feared. "We need to move quickly," Jason said, gathering his materials. "If Wells is planning something more extreme for tomorrow, we have to get ahead of it." As they dispersed to their assigned tasks, Ellie pulled Tyler aside. "I want you to stay with your grandparents tonight, just to be safe." The teenager started to protest, but stopped when he saw the determination in his mother's eyes. "Okay, Mom, but promise you'll be careful. Wells isn't just going to give up." "I know," Ellie replied, hugging her son tightly. "But neither are we." Dawn broke over Meadowbrook with an unseasonable chill, the kind that seemed to carry premonition on its breath. By 7 o'clock, the small town was already buzzing with unusual activity. Black SUVs and luxury cars with tinted windows passed through, heading toward the Carlton estate, where Harrison Wells was hosting what locals now understood to be far more than a simple gathering of friends. At the county animal facility, Sarah Cooper completed her final examination of Duke, the Palomino, whose escape had catalyzed their resistance against Wells. Though the drugs had mostly cleared his system, the horse still exhibited signs of psychological trauma, flinching at sudden movements and showing abnormal stress responses. "I've documented everything," she told Sheriff Landry, who had arrived to oversee Duke's return to Wells. "And I've included strict conditions for his care moving forward." Tom nodded, knowing those conditions would likely be ignored the moment Duke was back in Wells's possession. "Wells's attorney will be here at 9 to take custody." That gives Jason's story an hour to break before Wells realizes what's happening. "Do you think it will work?" Sarah asked, stroking Duke's nose gently. "Will exposing Wells really stop him?" "Men like Wells care about 3 things: money, power, and reputation," the sheriff replied. "This threatens all 3, if nothing else it'll disrupt whatever he has planned for today." Across town, Jason Miller sat in his small apartment, refreshing news websites and checking his phone repeatedly. He'd sent the story to 3 major news outlets and several influential bloggers who focused on animal welfare issues. Each contact had confirmed receipt and promised publication at exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The story was comprehensive: Tyler's photographs, Sarah's medical documentation, background research on Wells's history of controversial entertainment ventures, and testimonials from several Meadowbrook residents who had witnessed strange activities at the estate. Jason had been careful to present the facts objectively, letting the evidence speak for itself rather than making accusations that couldn't be proven. At precisely 9:02 a.m., his phone rang, a New York number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller?" a woman's voice inquired when he answered. "This is Vivian Chen from the New York Times. We're preparing to run your story on Harrison Wells, but we've just received a cease and desist letter from his attorneys threatening significant legal action if we publish." Jason's heart sank. "Already? How did they even know?" "We reached out to Wells' team for comment, as is standard practice," Vivian explained. "Their response was aggressive. My editors are concerned about the liability without additional corroboration." "Everything in that story is documented," Jason insisted. "The photographs, the medical reports." "Yes, but it's all from one small town, from people who know each other," Vivian countered. "We need something more independent. Do you have any sources from outside Meadowbrook? Anyone not connected to the local veterinarian or sheriff?" Jason's mind raced. "What about Wells's previous ventures? Did you follow up on those?" "We tried. Most people involved signed NDAs with substantial penalties. No one will speak on record." The call ended with Vivian promising to push for publication if Jason could provide additional verification, but her tone made it clear the story was now in jeopardy. In rapid succession, Jason received similar calls from his other media contacts. Wells's legal team had moved with stunning efficiency, issuing threats that had publishers balking. Their plan was unraveling. By 9:30, it was clear that none of the major outlets would run the story at 10 a.m. as planned. The best they could hope for was publication later in the day, after further fact-checking and legal review, too late to stop Wells's exhibition. Jason called the others with the bad news. Wells must have informants at these publications, he said, frustration evident in his voice. He knew exactly who to pressure and how. So what now? Ellie asked, her hope giving way to desperation. We just give up? Let him continue abusing animals for entertainment? There was a moment of silence on the conference call as each person contemplated their limited options. Maybe we don't need the mainstream media, Sarah finally suggested. What about social media? If we post the evidence ourselves, it would take too long to gain traction, Jason interrupted, and Wells could still have it taken down with copyright claims on the images or threats of defamation. Sheriff Landry cleared his throat. There's another option, but it's risky. Wells's guests are already arriving. What if we confront him directly in front of his potential investors? That's insane, Jason protested. He'd have us thrown out. Immediately. Not if we have leverage, the sheriff said thoughtfully. Wells still doesn't have Duke back. What if we delay the transfer? Tell his attorney there's a problem with the paperwork. That would only buy us an hour or two, Sarah pointed out. That might be enough, Tom replied. If we can create enough doubt in his investors' minds, even temporarily, it could disrupt his plans. As they debated strategy, Ellie remained silent, a plan of her own forming. When the call ended, she made a quick decision. Instead of driving to the county facility as planned, she turned her truck toward Main Street, pulling up outside the Bluegrass Diner, where Maggie Jenkins had been serving Meadowbrook's residents for over 20 years. Inside, the diner was unusually full. News of Wells's special guests had spread, and locals were gathered to discuss the wealthy outsider and his mysterious doings. Ellie's entrance caused a momentary hush. Everyone knew about Tyler's trespassing incident the day before. "Ellie, honey, you look like you haven't slept," Maggie called from behind the counter. "Coffee's fresh." But Ellie didn't sit. Instead, she stood in the center of the diner, facing her neighbors and friends. "I need your help," she announced, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "All of you. It's about Harrison Wells and what he's doing at the Carlton place." For the next 10 minutes, Ellie laid out the situation: the knife-throwing exhibitions using frightened horses, the drugging, the wealthy spectators paying to watch animals being terrorized. She showed them photos from Tyler's phone, passed around copies of Sarah's medical reports. "Wells has powerful friends and expensive lawyers," she concluded. "But we have something he doesn't: community. This is our town. These are our values. Are we really going to let this man use our home for his cruel entertainment?" The diner had fallen completely silent. Then, slowly, Mayor Wilson stood up. "What do you need us to do, Ellie?" At the county animal facility, Wells's attorney arrived precisely at 9 a.m., accompanied by 2 security personnel and a horse trailer. "We're here to collect Mr. Wells's property," she stated crisply, extending documents toward Sheriff Landry. Tom took his time reviewing the paperwork, searching for any legitimate reason to delay. "Everything seems in order, but Dr. Cooper needs to complete her final assessment and release forms. She's just finishing up now." Inside, Sarah was deliberately taking her time, performing unnecessary additional checks on Duke, documenting every possible concern. Through the window, she could see more vehicles arriving at the facility, pickup trucks and cars filled with Meadowbrook residents. Ellie's plan was taking shape. By 9:45, a crowd of nearly 50 local citizens had gathered in the parking lot, surrounding the horse trailer. Wells's attorney emerged from the building, visibly annoyed by the delay. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing at the growing crowd. Sheriff Landry maintained his professional demeanor. "Just concerned citizens, ma'am. They have a right to peaceful assembly." The attorney pulled out her phone, presumably to call Wells, but at that moment Duke was finally led out of the facility. The crowd's reaction was immediate, murmurs of concern as they saw the once magnificent horse's diminished condition, his nervous demeanor, the visible marks on his flanks. "That animal has been abused," someone called out. Others joined in, their voices rising in unified concern. Wells's security personnel moved toward Duke, but the crowd pressed closer, forming a human barrier. Not threatening, not aggressive, but unmovable in their collective presence. "This is obstruction," the attorney snapped at Sheriff Landry. "You need to clear these people away immediately." "Ma'am, as long as they're not breaking any laws, I can't remove peaceful protesters from public property," Tom replied calmly. "Of course, if you'd like to file a complaint." As the standoff continued at the county facility, Harrison Wells was greeting his guests at the Carlton estate. 20 of the wealthiest individuals in the country had arrived for his exclusive demonstration, each having paid $50,000 just to attend, with the understanding that investment opportunities would be available afterward. The arena was prepared. The new horses were in position, and Wells's team of assistants moved efficiently through their preparations. Everything was proceeding according to plan, until Wells's phone rang. His expression darkened as he listened to his attorney's report of the situation in town. "Handle it," he snapped. "Whatever it takes. The demonstration begins in 30 minutes, and I need Duke here." But when he ended the call, he found one of his most important guests, a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley, looking at him with newfound scrutiny. "Problem with the locals, Wells?" the man asked casually. Wells forced a smile. "Nothing significant. Small towns, small minds. They don't understand innovation." "Innovation?" The guest raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling it? Because I just received a rather disturbing email with some photographs that suggest otherwise." Wells froze, his smile becoming fixed. "Photographs? Of your training methods, sent from someone named Ellie Parker. Apparently, she shared them with all your guests." The billionaire held up his phone, displaying one of Tyler's images. "Care to explain why that horse looks terrified and drugged?" At that exact moment, Wells's phone began buzzing repeatedly as messages flooded in. His other guests receiving the same email, the same photographs, the same questions being raised just minutes before his demonstration was set to begin. Outside, the sound of vehicles approaching drew Wells's attention. Not sleek town cars or SUVs, but the trucks and sedans of Meadowbrook residents, dozens of them, parking along the road and gathering at his gate. They carried signs protesting animal cruelty, and many had their phones out, recording everything. "What is this?" one of the female guests demanded, watching the crowd through the windows. "Are we about to be part of some animal rights scandal? Because I can't afford that kind of publicity." Other guests murmured in agreement, already reaching for their phones, calling their drivers, preparing to distance themselves from whatever was unfolding. Wells attempted damage control, his voice strained beneath its practiced smoothness. "This is simply a misunderstanding. My methods are unorthodox but humane. The demonstration will make everything clear. I don't think we'll be staying for that," the tech billionaire interrupted, already heading for the door. "My foundation donates millions to animal welfare causes. I can't risk association with whatever this is." One by one, Wells's carefully cultivated audience began to leave, their interest in his entertainment concept evaporating in the face of potential scandal. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their presence documented by local news outlets and social media. By noon, the Carlton estate was eerily quiet. The staff had been dismissed, the equipment dismantled. Harrison Wells stood alone in his study, watching the footage of the protest on his laptop. His phone rang. His attorney again. "It's done," she reported. "We've secured possession of the horse, but this situation is problematic, Harrison. These images are circulating widely now." "Can we contain it?" Wells asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Doubtful. The story has been picked up by several animal rights organizations. They're calling for investigations into all your entertainment ventures. Some of your previous clients are already distancing themselves publicly." Wells ended the call without responding. His exhibition was ruined, his potential investors gone, and his reputation, the carefully crafted image of innovative entertainment pioneer, was being rapidly replaced by that of animal abuser. The financial implications were staggering, but, more importantly, his exclusive network of wealthy clients would now view him as toxic, a liability to their own carefully managed public images. Meanwhile, at the county line, Duke was being transported not back to Wells's estate, but to a specialized animal rehabilitation facility 3 counties away. A transfer arranged by Sarah and paid for by spontaneous donations from Meadowbrook residents. Wells's attorney had been outmaneuvered by Sheriff Landry, who had produced emergency documentation from the State Animal Welfare Department authorizing the horse's continued protective custody pending investigation. It was a temporary victory. Wells would undoubtedly fight it in court, but it bought precious time for Duke and potentially for the other horses still at the Carlton estate. That evening, Meadowbrook citizens gathered at the town hall, the mood celebratory, despite the understanding that their battle wasn't over. Harrison Wells had resources they couldn't match, and legal challenges would surely follow. What happens? Now? Mayor Wilson asked the core group who had orchestrated the day's resistance. "Wells won't give up easily," Jason warned. "He has too much invested in that property, in his exhibition concept." "But he's vulnerable now," Sheriff Landry noted. "The publicity, the scrutiny, it's exactly what men like Wells avoid. His whole business model depends on privacy and exclusivity." Sarah's phone chimed with a notification. "The story just went live," she announced, holding up her screen to show a major news website's homepage. The headline read, "Exclusive: Billionaire's Cruel Animal Entertainment Scheme Exposed by Small Town." "No, they finally ran it," Jason said, relieved. "Once one outlet committed, the others couldn't resist." Ellie, who had been mostly quiet during the celebration, finally spoke. "This feels like a victory, but we need to remember it's just the beginning. Wells still has those other horses, and people like him don't change, they just adapt their methods." "So we stay vigilant," Tom said firmly. "We keep the pressure on, maintain the spotlight." Wells came to Meadowbrook thinking he'd found a quiet place where no one would question his activities. We've shown him how wrong he was. As the meeting continued, plans were made for ongoing monitoring of the Carlton estate. Legal defense funds were established, and committees formed to coordinate with animal rights organizations. What had begun as a few concerned individuals had transformed into a community united by a common purpose. Outside the town hall, Harrison Wells sat in his black Bentley, watching the proceedings through the windows. His face betrayed no emotion as he observed the celebration, the sense of community and purpose evident even from a distance. After several minutes, he started the engine and drove away, heading not toward the Carlton estate, but toward the interstate. 3 days later, news spread through Meadowbrook that Wells had listed the Carlton property for sale. The asking price was significantly below what he had invested in renovations. More surprising was the discovery that the remaining horses had been quietly surrendered to a reputable equine rescue organization, along with an anonymous donation covering their care for a year. When Duke finally returned to Meadowbrook 6 months later, fully recovered and cleared for adoption, it was Ellie Parker who signed the papers. The magnificent Palomino would spend his remaining years in peaceful retirement on her small farm, far from the spotlight and the sound of knives cutting through air. Harrison Wells never returned to Meadowbrook. His precision entertainment concept disappeared from his portfolio of businesses, though rumors occasionally surfaced of similar ventures being developed in countries with less stringent animal welfare laws. But whenever such rumors reached Meadowbrook, Jason Miller would make a few calls to his media contacts, ensuring that uncomfortable questions would follow. The story of a small town that stood up to power and wealth spread far beyond Montana's borders, inspiring similar stands against exploitation and cruelty elsewhere. Because if Meadowbrook had proven anything, it was that community, when united by compassion and determination, could be more powerful than money or influence. That some values couldn't be bought, some lines couldn't be crossed, even by those accustomed to living above the rules. And in a world increasingly defined by what wealth could accomplish, that was a lesson worth remembering. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by Meadowbrook's courageous stand against injustice. For more captivating stories that explore the power of community against overwhelming odds, we've prepared a special playlist. Find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this tale of small-town resilience, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that examine the complexity of human connections and the strength found in unity. Don't miss our upcoming content, and please share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in Ellie's position? Your perspective matters to our storytelling community.